Now, for our next session, How to Avoid Repeating History, please welcome panelist Alan Emtage, Principal, Mediopolis, Inc., Brad Templeton, founder, the world's first .com, Clarinet, and Chairman Emeritus, EFF, and moderator Steve Ehrlich, Digital Assets Research Director, Forbes.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about this session today. I mean, not just for the fact that we have two Internet Hall of Famers to talk with, but in a lot of ways, I think that what we're going to discuss here is really the existential question that we're trying to get at. Google started out in Silicon Valley many years ago with the motto of "Don't be evil," and obviously it's fallen a little bit into disrepute these days. As a result, there's actually a blockchain company called Blockstack whose motto is "Can't be evil." But I suspect that the truth between those two is probably a little bit in between. And we have two people here that are really going to kind of help us understand some of the nuance of that question because of their distinguished histories in the internet. So, Alan, first, I'd like to just start with you. You created the world's first search engine. I'd love to kind of hear, have you briefly describe that story, but more importantly, talk about sort of what you learned from that experience.
Well, the story is fairly simple in many ways. I was trying to fill a need to do a job. I was working for the School of Computer Science at McGill University, where I was also a student and a sysadmin. And I became the person who they came to by kind of default because I was a pack rat to locate data and software on the internet. Remember, this is 1988, 1989, so much smaller internet, a non-commercial internet. Commerce was not actually allowed. It wasn't that there weren't any companies. A lot of it was, while it was the NSF net, it was publicly funded and commerce wasn't allowed. And so I developed a set of scripts to allow me to index the anonymous FTP archives, which is where we held most of the data. And at the time, we made it public at one point where we let people know that we had this information, and we got a stream of requests to search it, and we decided to make it public, make access to that data public, and that's how the first search engine came about. And I would say one of the things you learn from it is that you may be doing something for your own use and not realize that a lot of other people have use for it. But remember, we were dealing in a very different time, right? So, 30 years ago, the frenzied commercial activity of the internet wasn't around. So people weren't looking to get onto it to make a lot of money. It was often just a research project, either by companies with research arms or by universities.
Right, and that's a great segue to you, Brad, because you built Clarinet, the very first internet company, which was designed sort of to commercialize activity onto the net by selling newspaper and media subscriptions to universities and other elements. So you sort of saw that potential early on. So maybe just briefly talk a little bit about the origins of Clarinet and sort of what you took away from the experience.
Many people wanted to do a business over the internet, and I discovered there was a way that I could do that. And selling information seemed like the obvious first blush. Now, of course, many things have been created since then. And I'd been involved in actually doing comedy in the open and free internet for a long time. And so my first desire was simply to publish the columns of Dave Barry, a very popular humor writer in those days. He's still around. And that grew up, though, and exploded into publishing a full newspaper online. And I was a user of Archie as well. I'm also Canadian, so this is the all-Canadian session. In fact, as soon as we leave this, I'm getting on a plane to Canada so I can go to 2 weeks of quarantine. Lots of fun. So Clarinet sold itself to research labs and universities and commercial customers over the internet, which grew from having this non-commercial backbone to having internet service providers who had to be there first. providing that core underlying service, and everyone wanted to join. It wasn't until about 4 or 5 years later that suddenly the public's attention came on it, and it really exploded.
Great. So, through each of sort of your initial forays into the internet, from search engines and commercial activity, I'm sure that you sort of sat back at night, put your head on the pillow, and dreamt or thought about what all this would mean for the future of the internet in the next 5, 10, 50 years, and your companies in particular. Now that you've sort of seen the first several chapters of this journey, from where you started to where we are today, what are your impressions? Has it sort of gone as you've expected, and what sort of surprised you? Brad, maybe start with you first.
Well, certainly we'd never say it went as expected, but people might be surprised that even back in the 1970s, when I first got on the ARPANET, there was a mailing list there, which was the origin of an online community. And we used to talk about this thing, we called it WorldNet. It was going to be the place you were going to buy everything and do your banking and read your news and so on. And that really did come to be with most of the aspects of that 1970s vision. In fact, I think that much of it's been realized in great ways, and things, of course, nobody dreamed Facebook exactly. Nobody dreamed all the particular tools exactly. But nonetheless, a lot of it came to be. And it's only recently that people have actually started to get afraid of it in a deep sense. People have always been afraid of it. And in the previous session, you had Cindy Cohen from the EFF, and I was on the board of the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 20 years, dealing with all the ways that governments and societies would react to the internet changing their world. And I don't want to say that there wasn't plenty of that, because there was plenty. But the recent change that social media have made to altering the nature of democracy and weaponizing the use of propaganda combined with AI, that's the first thing that's really made me think to regret anything. There have been negatives and positives to everything in the past, but I would say mostly positive. This is the first one. I think we'll get through this. I think we'll find solutions to it. It's a very young problem, but nonetheless, that's actually after 30 years or even 50 years, if you want to say, the first time that I've seen something really negative happen.
And Alan, how about yourself?
Well, I think Brad was operating in a higher level than what I was operating at in terms of visions of the net. When we were doing Archie, and then through the Internet Engineering Task Force and the standard setting that organization does. I was working with, Tim Berners-Lee on the web, and Mark McCahill on Gopher, and Brewster Kahle on Waze and that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure that any of us really had a vision as to how big this was going to get. I'm not sure that any of us really brought the kind of vision where your toaster has an IP address and you can talk to it remotely, kind of thing. We were working in the user services area, which was kind of a new area at the time, because up until that point, or at least a neglected area, I shouldn't say not new, but neglected, because until that point we had FTP, Telnet, Usenet. The number of applications in the late 80s were quite limited. And so this explosion came about, and I would agree with Brad. I think all tools can be applied for good or for evil. That's not inherent necessarily in the tool itself. That's true of most all technology. But for the first time, the ability to manipulate large swaths of the population in ways that are fundamentally undemocratic. Really exploiting the basest instincts of human beings in ways that can have profound and have had profound impacts, I think, are truly concerning. And so it's not the scale as such as the interconnectedness. People that otherwise would have been screaming off into the void have found communities that are not positive, that are not helpful, that are working in ways that undermine fundamental institutions in our society.
And there's Sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Well, I should point out, though, that ability for small communities to find themselves and to scream into the void was actually one of the things we really loved in the early days. I mean, communities of that you never knew that there were a whole ton of people like you out in the world, and that's what attracted so many people to come in. That they were suddenly interacting and with people not just in their neighborhood but across the whole globe. Today, this is pretty mundane when I say this, but when it was new to us, it was marvelous. So that's the problem with what's happened today, is that it is just a particular reflection of something that at its core was very good, but has been perverted.
Sure. And those are all really important questions. And one other sort of tangent of that I wanted to ask about is also just the sort of the relationship that's been created from the current incarnation of the internet between these major technology companies, the Googles, Amazons, Facebooks, Apples of the world, and the people, where many individuals around the world feel that there's a disproportionate amount of value accruing to these large companies that have put up walled gardens around their data networks, and they're not necessarily doing good as sometimes they purport to do. And on top of that, sometimes it's even more disproportionate when we talk about more emerging economies that have less choice than individuals in the United States and Canada and the European Union. What are your thoughts on that? Brad, perhaps starting with you first.
It is a challenging question. Now, I think the companies are very different. For example, I'm more afraid of what Facebook has become than what Google has become. And Google is a company that, as huge as it is and as valuable as it is, and by the way, I often refer to Archie as the grandfather of Google when I talk about other things. So that's a good place to be. But they've also done some pretty remarkable things. I mean, they decided not to collaborate with the censorship of China, which Microsoft and other companies have all agreed to do. So they certainly have their ups and downs. Facebook was, of course, created to find interesting things to do with your data, and that gives it, unfortunately, the motives. One of the things I actually regret the most about what Google did to the world was that we only really found advertising as a way to monetize activity on the internet. I mean, it's not exclusive. There are some paid systems, and of course, Forbes now has a paywall too, but most of the vast majority of it is paid for only by advertising, because that was the easiest and least friction flow that allowed people to just use it without having to think too much about it and not pay for subscriptions. And that has unfortunately perverted what's gone on as well. It's, of course, driven the internet to be responsive to the wishes of advertisers than more to the wishes of users. Now, I have actually worked a little bit at Google on the self-driving car, and I've known the company since before it was founded. I've known the founders of it since before they started it. And I actually think that while I certainly don't agree with all the things they do, they usually have their hearts in the right place about this sort of stuff. But this is one thing that's distorted everyone, because where your money comes from is going to control what you do.
And Alan, how about yourself?
Well, I would agree with Brad that, in terms of the consequences for our institutions, that Facebook is more of a threat. I'm not sure if the threat's the right word, but certainly more of a concern than Google. But by the same token, I would say that all the search engines, and that's not just not Google. It's just that Google owns such a massive part of the space, is that we have no visibility into how those results are chosen. So, there have been studies, for example, in India showing that when certain political parties occur higher in the ranking for relatively neutral questions, it seems to have a positive impact on their vote totals, right? So we have no. I mean, these are the crown jewels, right? So it's very hard to go to Google and say, how is PageRank working these days? How are you ranking this stuff? Because at the end of the day, Google is the closest we've ever come to an omniscient being, right? You type in some vague search term, and you get the results you want. Like it's almost magical in some ways. It's not magic, but it comes pretty close. But we have no transparency into how they choose those rankings. And of course, the EU and so on have been concerned with Google putting its products up, running their products up to the top. And that's a fairly mundane concern, right? Yes, it has implications for commerce and anti-competitive behavior and so on and so forth. But, it could be a lot more insidious than that. It could be a lot more damaging than that. and we have no way of knowing.
Now, you're talking about the. Sorry, you were talking about the black box. Sometimes that's very hard to kind of see into.
Yeah, and it's by the same token, it's a black box, but it's also the proprietary information that makes Google as special as it is. So it's very hard to, unless you were to sort of turn Google into a public utility, it would be very hard for a private entity to balance to figure out what's going on there or solve that problem in any meaningful way.
Sure, I think it's hard for private entities to solve that problem. I mean, one of the great ironies is that Google inside was a super open company at the beginning. And after search engine optimization came around, they said, oh, we've got to hide how our algorithms work because the SEO people are going to basically try and cheat them and move up and game them. And so that created a different culture that was a little more secret, at least around that. They still try and keep an open culture the rest of the place. So they don't even know exactly how to deal with some of the problems that we're being asked about. Thinking that the regulators or that a public utility regulation commission could figure out is pretty challenging. And I certainly look at what's happened with Facebook recently when everyone's been saying, Facebook, you've got to censor yourself. You got to start shutting down the hate groups. You got to shut down Donald Trump, the alt-right groups. And after begging for that, I've seen nothing but complaints from people on Facebook about, oh, Facebook banned me for posting something fairly ordinary and censored me. When you ask for other people to take control, you usually don't like what you get. So that makes this problem really hard.
Yeah, and those are a couple of great segues to sort of my next question. And I'd actually like to tee it up by after I ask it by seeing sort of what the audience results were, because it's very similar to that, which is basically this event, we're talking about potentially building business models on top of the next version of the internet, which will involve probably many a decentralized tech stack. And my question to both of you, perhaps starting with Brad first, is will these applications built on top of potentially blockchain, will they be able to compete with the Googles and Facebooks? And also, how much do you actually think people care about things such as decentralization or privacy? They say they care if you ask them on the street, but they often take very little action to actually do things to protect their privacy.
Yeah, no, the way to make a small fortune in privacy is to start with a large one, as the joke goes. Now, I will say that Snapchat actually proved that wrong. They did actually make some money by giving people disappearing messages that people found valuable and protected their privacy. It is, you've hit on something I've pondered over for a long time, how to decentralize. Because one of the challenges of decentralization is if you distribute your Facebook, your social network out to 1,000 different servers, then now the blockchain people will tell me they think that I'm wrong about this, but you've actually created 1,000 paths of entry to your data, as opposed to when you have it in one place where there's at least one person protecting it. Now that one person can make mistakes. Facebook allowed Cambridge Analytica and other people to get into their data and misuse it. So there's certainly plenty of opportunity in both directions. Now, people don't unfortunately care a lot about decentralization. To sell them decentralization, you're going to have to really demonstrate why it's winning something for them in a very concrete way. Otherwise, the non-decentralized systems, they have vision behind them. They have one owner. There was a brief mention of Usenet made, which was the platform I used to build Clarinet in the early days. Usenet was the source of community on the internet for 10, 15 years, but it lost because nobody owned it and nobody could fix it and do things. While websites, there were 1 million websites run by 1 million people. They could all build whatever they wanted to build, and it would be, that's very decentralized. But it also meant that 1 million flowers could bloom, and some of those flowers could do very well and provide what people wanted. So it's very, very challenging. I've tried to dream of architectures because I haven't liked the way that these things are centralized. I think that there are some examples from the blockchain world, and maybe there are early teething pains, but they suggest this is not going to be quite as simple as the previous panelists suggested.
Great. Alan, you?
Yeah, well, actually, I have a real world example of this because my partner here, Michael Rhodes, actually built this. It's called Antisocial. It sits on GitHub, and it was an implementation, pretty much a full implementation, or much of the implementation of the major parts of Facebook in a distributed fashion. It was not built on blockchain. And it worked fairly well. One of the biggest challenges, and it was a question in your poll, and I haven't seen the poll results here, but one of the biggest challenges was the amount that, Facebook makes it practically impossible to get your data out. I mean, you can ask for a data dump, but it is presented in a format that one can only imagine is specifically designed to import somewhere else, right? And it was almost impossible. It was impossible to get any traction on it. We had a small network up of a number of nodes, and you could friend people, and you could share, and you had a news feed, and all of that stuff that Facebook does. But you controlled your own data, right? All of your data resided on your server, and only what you wanted to be served to the network was served. And it had a lot of the it had a whole protocol, and it had a lot of the features of Facebook. But at the end of the day, the two things that Facebook provided was an established network, right? So if you really still wanted to be friends with that person that you were back in high school, they're not really your they're in real life friend, but you like to see their family pictures every now and again or whatever. They're not on that network, right? And they're not going to have the technical expertise to spin up one of these servers and connect it into the network, number one. And number two, you already have all of your data in Facebook. Trying to get that out and replicate the 10 years, 13 years, whatever of your data that's in there right now, so that you can go back and look at your photographs from your 45th birthday, which are all stored there, and have all the comments from your friends and all that kind of stuff. There's no way, it's extremely difficult to recreate that in any meaningful sense. So people just don't, as Brad said, you're going to have to give them a really, really strong reason, a really compelling reason to make that switch. And privacy for most people isn't it. People are becoming a little more privacy conscious, but honestly, the simplest poll on Facebook, people will spill their guts for no reason at all, other than they just want to see what everybody else said. What did the majority say to this question? So the instinct for privacy, while a lot of people, talk a lot about it, the reality is people don't work very hard to maintain it.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to know what everyone's favorite Saved by the Bell episode was. So I don't mind that quite as much. But we have about a minute left, so I just have one final question for the two of you, perhaps a 30-second answer each, starting with you, Brad. What advice would you give to tech entrepreneurs looking to build new types of products and solutions as they try to determine whether or not it should be built on top of a decentralized tech stack or some of the more common setups that we see today? Or if you want to take a different approach, enterprises, as they're looking to build on top of the internet, what questions would you have them ask? What are your recommendations?
Well, I think that actually blockchain technologies are quite interesting, but they're not just a magic sauce you pour on something and it makes it better. All right. A lot of people seem to think that's what it is. You have to understand what the blockchain or the system underneath does for you. You have to understand why you need to have decentralized trust. If you're going to trust your life to something, to a company, there's no real reason that you need a decentralized system to trust your money to them, for example, as some people would propose. So you have to understand what's the real value of it, because you have to make it better than what existed before, and you have to make it as easy to get into as what you had before. And that's something that Facebook has. It's very easy to join Facebook. It's very easy to connect to your friends there. And of course, it's free. So you have to pull off all those things. And you want to make sure you're actually using the technology that goes after your real goals. See what your real goals are, see what the actual things the technologies underneath provide, and then pick your technology.
So, Alan, to take us out.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have anything to add to what Brad said. I think he covered it pretty well there. I haven't played in the blockchain field. I sort of pay attention to it on the side, but it's not something that I focus on a lot. But at the end of the day, you have to be solving a problem that people have, right? I mean, this is Harvard Business School 101, right? This is Business School 101. What I will say is that my experience would suggest that the one thing that one of the biggest mistakes that entrepreneurs make is, even if they have a good product, especially when they have a good product, is that in this commercial environment, they tend to get rather greedy, in the sense that they try to maintain control or too much control. You see the Zuckerbergs and the Pages and the Brins of the world who have maintained a lot of control over their companies and been very successful at it. But that is not a requirement for success. And I would suggest that it is better to have 10% of something big and successful than to have 100% of nothing.
Terrific. Well, with that, I'd like to thank both of our panelists and follow the trend set by my colleague Michael Del Castillo to give you a virtual round of applause. This was a terrific session, a lot of great insights, and look forward to monitoring what both of you are working on moving forward.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So that wraps up our session for today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. It was really insightful and informative, and I hope you enjoyed it. We touched on a lot of really key and important issues. I mean, the internet keeps trying to evolve. I thought Joe Lubin, founder of Consensus, had some great points talking about how when the internet was developed, we kept trying to jerry-rig previous business models on top of it, such as doing a radio show on TV and then putting advertising onto internet methods because we couldn't figure out a better way to monetize the internet and transfer value. Decentralization and blockchain might be a solution to that. And Dominic Williams, the founder of DFINITY, I think also touched on a really important point where he said that with the transparency and simplicity of a potentially decentralized internet, it could actually make things more secure, more transparent, and more equitable so that people can build on top of it. That said, with this very last session today with Brad and Alan, we really touched on the fact that there's a number of sort of key forces and headwinds that are going to push against this. And it's always going to be a little bit of a push and pull. As technology grows, there tends to be these natural trends towards monopolization because of how easy it is to scale. Plus the fact that most people are not necessarily tech savvy. So we're going to need companies most likely to build on top of these platforms and offer sort of centralized services with more familiar user interfaces and experiences. And whenever that happens, there's always a danger of there being certain degrees of decentralization. We didn't get to touch on this in the session today, but obviously building on top of blockchain, there's a number of decentralized applications that are trying to thread the needle of providing some of these services without too much centralization. And it's going to be really fascinating to see how these grow, what they evolve into as they mature. So this really is very much the start of a fascinating conversation. Look forward to keep writing about it, researching it, having more events like this. And with that, I'd just like to thank once again all of you for joining us, and stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you for attending the $1 Trillion Opportunity, How a New Internet Will Reimagine Your Business Model, presented by DFINITY.